Hello, welcome to this short video on study skills. I'm Dr. Alex Carter. I am Bi-Fellow for Study Skills at Fitzwilliam College. This video is going to be about listening, which is a skill which we don't pay much attention to, despite the fact that it's one of the skills we use most often. Indeed, according to some reports, we are listening 45% of the time that we're awake. Which sounds about right, to be honest. I mean, you're listening to me right now, I hope. I spend my time listening to people talk to me, giving lectures and so on. But of course, the key areas where we want to spend our time listening when we're students are in lectures, but also in supervisions. And indeed, this has come up a few times with a few students who've mentioned to me that they've had difficulty listening to what other people are saying to them, in particular during supervisions, because they feel like either a sense of pressure to say the right thing or to understand exactly what's being said and to engage in a level of discourse which perhaps they're unfamiliar with. And that's entirely natural. And my aim here is to give you a few bits of practical advice that will help you. But first, let me start with a little bit of theory. I'm a philosopher. I apologise, I'm going to talk about a little bit of philosophy. But this is really interesting philosophy. It's not even the type of philosophy that I'm personally invested in, but it's the philosophy of language. And Paul Grice was a philosopher in the last century who was talking about how communication takes place. And he denied, for instance, that communication is simply a process of someone speaking and someone understanding what was said. It's not simply that process. I'll come on to why shortly, but I also want you to think about this as well. But what he argues instead is that what we need is a form of communication whereby what is understood on the basis of what the person has said, and on the basis that the person is trying to get me to understand. Now, I hope that makes sense, but it is somewhat complicated, and it might feel a little bit like philosophers are overcomplicating something that's very simple. But I think it's important because this has stayed with me from reading Grice as a student myself, and I've been teaching this recently, and it always comes back to haunt me, this idea that it's not this simple relationship between speaker and listener. And so this slight extra complication of making sense of the communication only on the basis of what the speaker intends to communicate, I think is quite powerful and quite important. But why do you think it might matter? Pause the video here and have a think about this, and then we'll go on and have a look at some of my suggestions for why. Okay, assuming you've done that, one of the reasons why, and I stress this is only one reason why the extra level of complication is needed, is that communication is quite often indirect. By which we mean, when I'm speaking to someone, I might be trying to convey a meaning that you will understand on the basis of my intention, but not on the basis of what I have said. So for instance, if someone asks me to tell them, is this a good student? What's so great about them? And I say, they're punctual. Well, the implication from that I'm intending the other person to understand is that the best thing I can say about them is that they arrive on time. Now, obviously that's a mean thing to say. I would never say it, but it is Paul Grice's own example. He says, if I'm writing a reference for a student and I say they're punctual, clearly that's a bad reference. But I've said something nice, but of course I'm intending that the other person understand the implication of all the things that I haven't said. So likewise, we can say things, and this is a platitude, we accept this as generally true, that Alex doesn't always say what he means, but he does mean what he says. So the point here is that academia, being the kind of communication that it is such that it's A, complicated, it's often dealing with very abstract and complex ideas, but it's also B, kind of in communication, by which I mean you understand what I'm saying because you've done the work like I have. So authors are communicating to people who, like them, are interested in the same sorts of things. It's not like an advert or talking to a friend where, generally you might be telling them about something they don't know about. The author expects you to already know a lot of what they're talking about and that they're trying to argue a particular case. So the point here is a lot of our communication is indirect. So that's our problem. What about the solution? Well, one technique that sort of just springs out, and this is one of the areas in which there has been some work around what listening skills and how to develop them, is in the area of active listening. And this is a technical term that's used within certain professions. For instance, counsellors and therapists will use active listening to make sure that they're hearing exactly what the patient is telling them or exactly what their client is telling them. And it's distinct, therefore, from other forms of practices that therapists and counsellors might use, such as reflective listening or empathic listening. Obviously, I'm not encouraging you to use in that exact sense. I'm not asking you to treat other people like clients. What I'm suggesting is that in a general sense, we can make sense of the idea of listening as a passive thing that we do, by which I mean you might have this playing right now as a video in the background and you may not be really listening to what I'm saying, but now that I'm talking about you listening passively, you've now diverted your attention. So how is that different? What's the difference between hearing someone passively and actively listening, meaning treating it as something that I'm doing rather than something that's happening to me? Well, a writer friend of mine once quoted this, and it's always stuck with me. He's a screenwriter, and he said, never, or just don't write dialogue. It never happens in real life. We don't get dialogues between individuals. If I'm speaking to someone, generally what will happen is they'll start speaking, they'll say something that perhaps I agree with or don't agree with, they'll continue speaking, but I've already decided what I'm going to say. And when they finish speaking, I'll say that thing that I was going to say beforehand. Meaning that what's happening is really we've got slightly overlapping monologues. We don't have anything like a dialogue. Now, if like me, upon hearing that, you feel slightly embarrassed, please don't, because that is human nature. This is what most of us are doing most of the time when we're engaged in conversation, not listening to the other person. And that's a problem. It's definitely a problem, but it's not one that's unique to you. It's something that all people struggle with. And this is why I find it so remarkable that people don't talk more about listening skills. Just to sort of point in the direction of another philosopher who really interests me on this topic is Simone Weil. Simone Weil was a theologian and a philosopher in the mid-20th century, and she's remarkable for all sorts of reasons. But one of the reasons why I'm mentioning her now is that she says, having genuine empathy or sympathy for another person, remember the example of empathic listening, genuinely wanting to hear from another person about what they have to say, is, she says, something like a miracle. She actually equates it with turning oxygen into gold, meaning it's a really hard thing to do, to abandon all of your pretensions, all of your expectations, all of what you want to hear, to just allow the person to be. It's a decreation of yourself to allow the other to be. Now, I don't think you need to do that, but I do think it's important that when she tries to explain how you would do this, she puts it in the form of a question. She says the Holy Grail, and this is true in the myth of the Holy Grail, the Holy Grail gets given to the person who asks its keeper, which is a king, what are you going through? So if you want the Holy Grail, if you want this sort of secret promise, then what you need to say to the person is, what are you going through? Now, that's miraculous, that's profound, that's all about ethics. When it comes to just general listening, what I'm getting at here is that there needs to be some sort of sympathy or empathy for the other. And if you connect this with what Grice said, that it's not just about hearing what was said and understanding it, it's also about trying to understand the speaker's intention. You get a sense of this idea that what's going on is a slightly more evolved form of what we're trying to do, or of what we're normally doing when we listen. So my own take on active listening can be put down quite simply to this rather pithy and probably overly simplistic phrase: I want to know more, not just what. So I don't want to know just what you have to say. I want to know more about what you're saying. Now this comes in many forms, and I'm going to talk about some of the practices that we might engage with. So in the first instance, we want listening to be active, by which I mean we're either asking questions for clarification. So when someone finishes, we don't say that's wrong. We don't say, oh, that's like this, isn't it? We say, is that like this? Or have I got it right if I say this? Have I understood you right if I say this? Again, it's an encouragement of the other person to give you a little bit more, Because invariably what we do with language is we're circumspect. We try and say as little as possible. We try to convey only what meaning we need to convey for the other person to understand, but we so often get that wrong. So it's about being active in our listening and engaging in questions. If you can't ask questions, frame them in your mind as you're listening. What are they trying to say here? Why might they be trying to say it? And so on. I know this is all very much teaching you to suck eggs, and I'm sure you do this already, but it's about doing it when you need to do it, not just simply when you're most perplexed, but also when there's something seemingly normal being said to you and you think you understand. That's when we're most likely to misunderstand, when we're passive because we think we know what they're saying. Equally, if you try repeating back what they've said, so if you say, so if I were to repeat what you said, I would put it like this, and then say, is that right? Repeating it back can help as well, because that sort of in some way does what we're talking about with Grice. It tries to uncover the intention by now me saying it to you. Resist the urge to conceal inconvenient facts. Now, as I said, we're all circumspect with what we say, and often this is just unbiased. It's just we don't say the thing that, we don't have quite the right words to say what we want to say. But sometimes, and we have to be intellectually honest and brutal with ourselves, sometimes this is because we want to conceal things. We know that there's a big hole in our argument. We know that there's a problem example that they could bring up. Bring it up yourself. There is absolutely nothing to be gained by letting someone else say what's wrong with your view. If you say it, then at least you're saying, I know that this is a problem and I will think about how I can respond to that. Ask people to slow down. I speak far too quickly. I apologize for that right now. One thing I will say is if you're listening to a recording, you can of course go back and listen to it again. But if you're in conversation with someone and what they're saying just is going right over your head because they're perhaps speaking too quickly or you just can't take it in, ask them to slow down. This is respectful. This is asking them for their own sake to slow down so that you can understand what they're trying to say. I want to know more of what you're saying, but I need you to give it to me in a slightly slower fashion. Resist the urge to disregard what people have said because you disagree with it or find it dull. This is really hard. I mean, I say that like everyone wants to do this. I appreciate you all want to resist the urge to disregard what people are saying, but really work hard, especially if you're finding what they're saying either uninteresting, which happens. You may be finding what I'm saying uninteresting right now, or you might simply disagree with what I'm saying right now. And for that reason, you might try and disregard it. Fight that urge. Really try hard not to do that. Record and listening back to any conversations you might have, provided the other person's in agreement. So if you're on Zoom and you're having a supervision, you could say, is it okay if we record this? And can you send me the recording when it's done? Some supervisors will say no, others will say yes. It's worth asking, it's always worth a try. If you're in a reading group, you can have a recording done. If you're in a lecture, you can make sure that you get the lecture recording. Even if it's being delivered live, it might well be being recorded. And this is vital. Don't let those recordings rob you of the chance to engage with the speaker. So just because you know the recording's being done, don't let that trick you into thinking, oh, well, it's fine, I can just listen back to it later. Engage with it in the moment, especially if you're in conversation, because you only have one chance to have that conversation with that person. If you have another conversation with them, that's another conversation. In this one moment, you've only got one chance to ask questions, and in a recording, you cannot do that. So it's always worth trying to engage with the listening and forget that you're recording something. Okay, on that note, here's a test. Can you, without going back in this video, pause the video here and write down all 6 pieces of advice I just gave? Now this, again, is just a test of your memory and of whether you were listening, but of course it's more of a test of memory than it is of listening, but even so, I thought it was worth throwing in. So pause the video here and see if you can remember all 6 pieces of advice I just gave. Okay, I'll assume you've done that. If you haven't, that's naughty. If you went back and you cheated, that's even more naughty. But if you have done it and you want to go back and check to make sure you got it right, obviously feel free to do so. Okay, the last piece of advice I have on this is to say that storytelling can often be a way of helping with listening and with memory as well. So For instance, if you are engaged in a particular topic and you want to understand it better, it's useful to understand your learning journey as a kind of narrative. And one way in which you might do this is thinking in terms of a nose-to-tail narrative and in terms of a micro story. And what I mean by those are, a nose-to-tail narrative is, how did I get to where I am now? What's this moment now, and how did I get here? So for instance, I struggled with this idea, but then I got over that, and then I read this book and that was really useful, and that got me better understanding this, and so on and so on. Now I'm in this moment, and this moment might be waiting for a supervision to start, it might be writing an essay, but whatever you're doing at that particular moment, what's going forward from there is your micro story as you're seeing it now. So narratives go back, are backwards facing, micro stories are forward facing. This was a revelation to me, by the way. Someone else gave me this revelation, because I always made sense of life as a narrative. In fact, my thesis was on that topic. But the idea of life having this kind of forward facing, much shorter narrative shocked me a little bit and gave me a lot to work with. So here you have this idea of a micro story going forwards, and it's determined by that narrative, but of course it's not yet determined. So the point here is, what should I do in this supervision, and how will it inform my learning journey so far? What do I need to find out that I haven't found out so far? What kind of journey am I making? So I'm slowly investigating this issue, and this is interesting me more and more and more. In this supervision, I've now got the next journey in that narrative to take place. What should it look like? It's just simply a way of reorienting yourself and making sure you're thinking about where you're coming from and where you're going to. It's a very simple technique. It's not profound. It's not particularly theoretically interesting. It's simply a useful technique that I found is quite helpful when I'm going into a meeting or I'm going into a lecture, to think, what's the story that's going to fit into the narrative now? And how do I tell it as I go forwards? Okay, I hope some of that advice was useful. There are other videos that I'm making for Freshers Week that will be available to you. Please do look at those. If you have any questions, you can email me, you can tweet at me. We can arrange a one-to-one supervision, whether in my office or on Zoom. I'm always happy to speak to people. You don't have to be having a particular problem now in order to have a chat with me. We can talk about any aspect of study skills that interests you. Or you might foresee a particular issue coming up, and as I say in my time management video, now is always the perfect time to have that conversation, because now you might have time. When time management becomes a problem, it's because you haven't got time. So now is always a good time to engage with this stuff. In any case, I hope you found watching this video useful. See you next time. Thanks very much.